And welcome, Hoosier fans, to this week's edition of Banner Monday, where we begin the week the best way we know how by talking Indiana basketball and Big Ten hoops. I'm the coach, Brian Tonsoni, and I'll be here with Mike DeCourcy. But first, a couple of quick housekeeping notes off the top. Number one, in this time, keep supporting our friends at Homefield Apparel at homefieldapparel.com. Promo code Assembly20 for what they do in the Indianapolis local community and outside of it in supporting people in this time of need. The second reminder is if you want to support your local food banks, go to foodpantries.org/ or feedingamerica.org, again, to help those in need during this fight against the virus. And a reminder also every Thursday night, Ryan and the gang and Jared and Andy on Assembly Call Radio every Thursday night, 9 o'clock Eastern. And also look for the Crimson Cast podcast as we have partners up with them. But now I'm pleased to welcome in from the Big Ten Network, the Sporting News, and Fox, one of the hardest working men in college hoops, and even when there are no college hoops to cover, it's the venerable Mike DeCourcy. Mike, how are you doing on this Monday?
I am well, Brian. How are you?
I'm doing well as time passes, and hopefully safely we're starting to see a little bit of an opportunity to get some sports back into our life. So hoping that everyone, including you and your family, are safe as we go forward. But we're going to talk a little bit about off-season topics, which sometimes are hard to find as you do. We do a podcast every week and we talk every week, and then especially with this coronavirus. But let's talk a little bit about schedule and schedule building from your perspective. The NCAA came out with some new scheduling items where you can schedule 28 plus 3 tournament games or 29 and 2 tournament games. What that basically does for major college basketball is you have your league games plus a non-conference schedule. For the Big Ten and Indiana University, that is 20 league games, which leaves 11 non-conference games to be scheduled. We have seen across the nation, Mike, some teams that go soft and only play 2 or 3 real tough opponents, and some even inside the Big Ten who will play 7 or 8 big-time tough opponents in the non-conference. And you and I both do some bracketology, and so you could take this from whatever perspective you want, a bracketologist, a sports writer covering, or just a fan of the game. But what do you believe colleges should do, and does it depend on, obviously, makeup of the team and so forth, but in scheduling their non-conference opponents, what thoughts do you have on scheduling?
Well, I think the first thing that needs to be understood is that most schedule analysis / criticism that's done by sports writers, unfortunately, is done from the perspective of, give me something to watch. That's the first problem. It's not about what is best for your team. It is, if you are playing teams that I am not interested in, I am not interested. Therefore, it's bad. And that's not the way that any coach should or does schedule. They schedule to build the best possible series of challenges for their team, and ultimately to get into the NCAA tournament. Those are their 2 primary concerns. And what a sports writer thinks about who's got the toughest schedule doesn't matter at all. What a computer thinks matters, but what a sports writer thinks, or a sports commentator thinks, doesn't matter and shouldn't. And when I've looked at scheduling, I remember in 1991-92 when Sean Miller was a fifth-year senior point guard at Pitt. I was covering the Panthers for the Pittsburgh Press at the time. And they wound up playing one of the most difficult schedules that I can remember. I mean, they played almost no gimme games, so to speak. They played in the preseason NIT that year, and so they won a game, I think, against Siena, maybe, which was a pretty good team. And then they played at Kentucky and pulled an upset. So then they go to New York, and I think they played Oklahoma State, Texas, and then they went from there to Hartford for the ACC Big Ten Challenge and played NC State. And it was just a series of that. And then they got into a very challenging Big East. And by the end of the year, that team was completely spent. And what promise they had was wrung out of them by a schedule that was too good for their team. And I think over time, what I've developed in my mind is that you should start with a base of one seriously difficult home game, one seriously difficult neutral game, one seriously difficult road game. And then the rest of it should be basically built according to the nature of your team. If you're a real team and don't play at least one of each of those, you're probably not doing it right. You should have at least one of those by the time you get to conference play or by the time you get fully into conference play. I mean, you may not have one of each of those categories with the way leagues are now by the time you get to that first December window. But by the time you get into January, you should at least have one in each of those categories. If you have a significant veteran established team that was a big winner a year ago and is all back more or less intact, then you have to schedule your team at a more challenging level just because they'll get bored. I mean, if you give them too many bye games, they're going to get bored. And you're not going to get improvement because they'll get bored with things that they know they can do. When I covered Cincinnati in the mid-'90s, I mean, almost every bye game was the same game. They'd come out, they'd play hard, they'd play seriously. They would wreck the other team so badly that the other team completely forgot they were playing basketball. They'd be up 25 or whatever, and then the Bearcats would get bored in the second half, and they wouldn't play very hard, and the other team would make a run because they'd throw in a couple threes. Then eventually the Bearcats would play just hard enough to get it back to maybe what the halftime margin was. And then Huggins would come in after the game and yell about how his team didn't take things seriously. I mean, I could practically do the rant by rote. I heard so many times. And so you have to challenge your team so that they don't get that level of boredom if you have a lot. If you have a team that is developing, and I think I would put Indiana in this category, you can't overwhelm them because they still need to learn what it means to be great. They know how to win now. I mean, they've got enough guys who have been winners. They didn't get to the tournament because it didn't happen, but they would have. So they've got enough. They have enough guys who know more or less how to win, but they also know how to lose. I mean, they lost that Arkansas game, for instance, a game they should easily have won, not because Arkansas wasn't pretty good, but because they had the game in control and they stopped doing the things that got the game in control. So they know how to lose as well. So you have to build that up a little bit. And so you don't want to overwhelm them, but you still need enough challenges that if you push the right buttons and they push the right buttons, then your significant potential doesn't turn into, but they didn't play anybody. And then you have the teams, and I'm not sure who would fit this category off the top of my head in the Big Ten. I'm just, Michigan State's in transition. I think everybody is enough in transition, lost enough that I'm not sure if anybody quite fits this. Rutgers probably comes closest, but they haven't really won at a high level yet either. So I'm not sure whether there's a team in the Big Ten that fits that category. But let's say Gonzaga doesn't work because they have a lesser league schedule. Okay, Villanova, they're loaded. So Villanova, they need a steady series of challenges, one after the other, very little exercise in between. Maybe a little get them going, but they need to play a steady series of challenges because they know they're terrific and they know they're going to contend for the national championship and they want the best possible seed. So you don't want to overwhelm them either, but a couple of bye games, maybe 3 is probably enough for them. And of course they have the advantage of playing in the Big Five where they know they can get a look. I mean, if St. Joe's, for instance, and I don't know what they shape up like next year, but if they come into next year as bad as they were this year, that can equate to the bye game, the easy bye game that you might ordinarily schedule. They already know it's on there because they're playing in the Big Five. Whereas Temple, might be a middling game or something like that. So that's the 3 levels of teams that you have to consider, which you have. And again, it all comes down to schedule strength rating, and making sure that your team is polished and ready for conference play. And lastly, the idea of being well seeded in the NCAA tournament. And I can go back to when Ben Howland was at Pitt and Jamie Dixon took over. I mean, they played notoriously bad schedules at Pitt and were constantly destroyed for it in the media. And yet, really, in the end, if you looked at the seeds that they got when they were good, it usually only made a difference of about one seed line. And did that make a difference to them? I mean, in 2004, if they'd have been the 2, they wouldn't have had to play Oak State in the Sweet 16. Maybe they go further. Who knows? But they also won they won the Big East that year and all that, Big East tournament. And so I'm not sure that that it was enough. It would have been better if they played a bit more challenging, probably, but not enough to get the hysteria that you sometimes get with schedule criticism. The last thing I will say is, when you are a team that has what I call scheduling power, you need to use it. And I think Indiana has scheduling power that it has not used over the last decade or so. Indiana is still Indiana. I mean, it hasn't performed at the level that it maybe historically has or it aspires to over the last 10 or 15 years. But it still has a great tradition, a television network that assures that the opponent will be televised nationally. It has a great building that visiting players want to play in. So I think you need to invest in that. Invest in, if it costs you a little bit more money to buy a game, that, okay, it's not that, no one's asking for $500,000, it might be another 20, 30,000, whatever, but you've got to use that power. Now, you don't have as much scheduling power as Duke does right now, because Duke has been better recently and has a bigger brand now, but you still have more than most of the teams in your conference. Not all, but most. And so you need to use that. And what I mean by that is, if you're going out to do a buy game, you shouldn't be buying number 300. I mean, you should be able to do better than that. And I think we're seeing, to an extent, an improvement in what we've seen of their non-conference schedule and their buy games. I have Robert Morris down as a game. I mean, that's a good game to schedule. Robert Morris won their league last year. It's not going to get you a super high schedule strength rate or our net rating or whatever. They don't bring that in because they play in one of the lighter leagues. The Northeast is probably a bottom 5 league, bottom 7 league. So they were the champions in the tournament of that league last year. They're usually up near the top of that league. Andy Toole does a great job. That's the kind of game you got to schedule more often or better. I mean, get the champion of the Summit League or one of the contenders. Get the champion of the Horizon League or one of the contenders. You play Northern Kentucky, those kinds of teams. Wright State. Those are teams that you should be eagerly trying to schedule. And I think you can get those games because in your current mode of development, they're going to think they got a shot. You haven't proven yet that they're going to come in just to look around at the banners like they do when they go to Duke. You haven't proven that yet. So I think you can get some of those teams to take that game because they're going to come in thinking they have a shot to beat you. I think this year Indiana will be better and probably won't lose games like that or be likely to. But I think you can get that game. And I'm not necessarily in Northern Kentucky, but that kind of team that can help increase your schedule strength rating so that when you do well, your net ranking goes up, your schedule strength rating goes up, and you're more fondly considered by the members of the selection committee.
Yeah, Indiana right now has 5 games with the Maui Classic, the Crossroads, and the ACC already baked into their schedule, and a possibility for the Gavitt games, which would put 6 quality teams on their schedule out of 11. You've mentioned Robert Morris. They have Omaha out of the Summit League, and they played South Dakota State last year out of the Summit League. And everyone was upset with Indiana because of their, quote, cupcake schedule. But what they did, and when I looked into it, is they took leagues that were like 19 through 23 and took teams that were in the top half of that to bring in. Maybe not name recognition for fans, but they turned out to have above 500 conference records. And when you looked at Indiana's strength of schedule at the end of the year, a lot of fans were surprised that it was ranked higher, high. And so with right now, Indiana either has 3 or 4 games left to fill, depending on whether they play in the Gavitt games. What they're missing is that one marquee game that you said at home, because I believe they're in rotation to be on the road in the ACC. They're in rotation to be on road in the Gavitt. I know those things can change, and they aren't set in stone. But that would be all 6 of those games being on the road. They need to, for their fans, and maybe, then they schedule a marquee game. That's 7 out of 11 marquee games. Is that okay for Indiana to go that deep into that to get that home game?
Well, I do think you need to have, so, remember, you are, quote, in the entertainment business. And so you're trying to sell tickets. And I mean, if anybody does this year, you have to go into it with the assumption that you're going to sell tickets this year. And so you do want to have, for your season ticket holders, something to chew on, so to speak. You want to have a little bit of meat on that bone. And so, yeah, I think the trying to play a name top team, it doesn't have to be Duke or Carolina or whatever, but somebody from another conference that people would get excited about. I'm trying to, let's say Xavier, just to use it. And, they've been good. They've been, they're a team that your fans should get excited about in the way that Marquette was a couple of years ago. That might've been a Gavitt game. It might've been, but it was a home game and a chance to see a good quality team at Assembly Hall. But that's sort of opponent, I think. And if you can do better than that, great. But I think that level of opposition is good for Indiana at this point. And I don't think that it would be, again, especially in an era when regional travel might not be a bad thing. I mean, a trip to Cincinnati on the bus might not be so bad.
And so that brings us to the Big Ten schedule, which is not a round robin, obviously, because of the number of teams. But it was difficult to win on the road. And from a bracketology vantage point, road wins seem to be important recently. Rutgers was running up against it. Indiana was running up against it in their consideration for a seed line of winning on the road, yet winning in the Big Ten. So how hard is it to win in the Big Ten right now? And do you see that changing year to year, or was it just a year last year where, man, it was really difficult for anyone to win on the road? And then that also does eventually affect your non-conference schedule too, because you're playing 20 juggernaut games. I think the bottom teams are going to be better and not just win 2 or 3 as well next year. So I kind of see this continuing into next year's schedule. But how hard is it to win in the Big Ten on the road?
It really is difficult. In the Big Ten, more than any other league, especially when you go 1 to 14. The problem that you have in the Big Ten that State Kentucky doesn't have in a lot of cases when it goes on the road, or other members of the SEC when they go on the road. When Kentucky goes on the road, there are a lot of occasions where their fans can invade because some of the opposition doesn't traditionally sell out or come close to it on a season ticket basis. Now, that's not the case at Florida, for instance, but it is the case at a lot of their opponents in the SEC, so that they can invade and neutral out the crowd a little bit, so it's not as bad. And other teams in the SEC will play against a smaller house. In the Big Ten, that doesn't happen very often. The Big Ten has led the nation in attendance for almost 35 years in a row. And that's not just, it's not because they have the biggest buildings. I mean, they have plenty of nice sized buildings, but it's also true. It's also the capacity, the percentage of capacity you're filling, so many full houses you're playing against, and it makes it more difficult than in a lot of conferences. And so as a result, it becomes very difficult for everyone to win on the road. And teams understand, there starts to become this mentality, well, it's going to be hard to get on the road, so we have to win every home game. And they invest more desperation into winning that home game because they know it's going to be hard to get one on the road. I went through the Big Ten, and not just on a overall basis, not just within the Big Ten, but on an overall basis, there was only one team in the Big Ten last year that had a winning conference record. That was Michigan State. Every other team was 500 or below. And that, like I said, that's not just conference play, that's all play. Because winning on the road in the Big Ten is so difficult. that it's hard to finish over 500 as a road team, even overall. I don't think that's going to change. It's hard to say at this point that the league will be as strong at the top as it was this year, but I expect the depth of the league to come close to matching what it did this year, maybe even surpassing, because we had two bad teams in the Big Ten this year with Nebraska and Northwestern. Might not be any next year. I mean, Northwestern's going to be a year older. All their guys are back, basically. They still have some things they probably have to polish up a little bit, but I think they can be more competitive than they were a year ago. Nebraska's got a lot of transfers. Don't know how that works out, but Fred's a heck of a coach. And so they have a chance to be better. And I don't see a huge backslide in a lot of places. Minnesota is going to lose Daniel Oturu, but they have a lot of players back. They have some players coming in, a chance to at least tread water from an overall standpoint, maybe improve. We'll see. So I don't see that backsliding. So I think it's going to be just as difficult in a lot of ways to win on the road next year in the Big Ten. And as a result, you do, like I said, you do have to measure how much you challenge your team out of conference relative to how much you expect them to achieve.
So you mentioned Michigan State having a winning record on the road. I remember Illinois had a good run where they beat people on the road last year. On the other hand, Indiana struggled. I mentioned Rutgers until their win at Purdue. That might have been something that kept them out of the NCAA tournament, even though they had a solid year. What kind of team, makeup-wise, in general, is needed to win in this kind of environment in the Big Ten?
I think toughness, first of all, is mental and physical toughness are really important. If you look at some of the teams that did well on the road last year, and Michigan State is a team that we all associate with toughness in both physical and mental toughness. And so not surprising that they would be able to go and win on the road. You know, I think Seton Hall was a team that a lot of people looked at that way. And they were a team that had a really good road record. Didn't have as good a home record as they should have, given the talent that they had. Maybe mentally sometimes tried to let the home crowd win it for them and relaxed. But instead, they, when they went on the road, they were really competitive and really tough. And I think having playmakers too really helps you. Having guys like Kansas had a great road record. They only lost one road game last year. And having a Devon Dotson really helped. Having a Cassius Winston really helped. For Villanova, having reliability at the point guard position really helped. I think all of those teams had that guy who could take control of the offense and make sure that everybody was calm when they needed to be calm, cool things down. Or, when the moment called for it, they could go make a play. Oregon did not have a great road record last year, but when they were playing at Michigan, they won the road game because Peyton Pritchard said, "I'm not letting us lose this. It's not happening." And he just started to attack. I think he scored 13 or 14 consecutive points at one juncture in the game late. And so having that kind of guy with the ball in his hands can really help you. And we talked a week ago about what Robert Finney can be, and I'm a believer. I don't think that we've seen everything he has. Some of it health, some of it, maybe chemistry. I still think that he can be. Do I think he's Cassius Winston? No. I don't think he's a first-team All-America player, but do I think he can be a first or second-team All-Big Ten player? Yeah, I think he can. He obviously has to play much better, but I think he has it in him.
So you mentioned some qualities there in Robert Finney. Besides Robert Finney, does Indiana have that mental toughness coming back next year? Is that something that advances with experience? Because 8 of the top 9 rotational guys are coming back, plus you add some real tough, competitive freshmen. And I add to that the closer. You kind of mentioned that, someone to go get a bucket. That's what Illinois did with IU. They gave him the ball, and he was able to win games. So you mentioned the playmaker, someone to calm down and run the show in Robert Finney. Does Indiana have that mental toughness overall? And who would you say would be a closer next year to help Indiana get better on the road?
I think that what I talked about before about not being there yet, I don't think they've displayed that yet. that they have that quality. I mean, that Maryland game was early February that they had the game and they let it get away. Mm-hmm. That was an example of a team that needed to play more mentally strong down the final 4 minutes. Offensively, I'm not going to say who it was that took the shot, but there was a shot.
I think it was Al Durham took a quick shot.
Yeah, that's
a
the
minute.
Shot. Yeah, that's
minute
the
and a half or something.
Yeah. Yeah, it was a quick trigger shot with a 6-point lead, and when you should have been, if it was a layup, it's a layup, but it was a jump shot guarded. It was, that kind of thing. Those are the things that you have to learn from, and I think that we've talked a lot of times about the various guys on the team who can get better from that standpoint, and I think the one guy that I'm not going to put any of that on. Because he was only a freshman, but now, coming back as a sophomore with significant talent and significant expectations. And I don't mean from us, I mean from him. I mean, he wants to be a pro. He believes he's a pro, and he probably is. Almost certainly is a pro, but to be a good one, I mean, he has to be able to say, okay, I'm getting this done the way Jalen Smith did in that game. And that has to be traced next year. For Indiana to be what it is capable of being, what it should be, and I really like Trace's game. I think he will be that. I've liked him from the first time I saw him at the Peach Jam before his senior year. Really fell in love with what he's capable of doing, and so I think that it'll come, but I don't think they're there yet, and that's why Maui is important for them. If they get in Gavitt, what they have in that game. What they're asked to do and what they're capable of finishing is important for them. That first month is a really important month for Indiana because there'll be so many challenges and maybe only one or two of them in advantage situations, playing at home, I mean. And so they're going to have to be physically and mentally tough to do well in the series of challenges that they're likely to face before they even get to the middle of December.
Yeah, I'm personally counting on the experience, plus a little push from, I don't think the freshmen will have a major impact, but they're all competitive, and that'll hopefully, encourage everyone to increase their mental toughness enough because Indiana has to play better on the road in the Big Ten to move up the standings. That's for sure. So, Mike, I'm just going to end up here asking you a couple personal questions about venues. We talked about toughness playing on the road. When you say that you like a venue, is it from a working aspect, what's best for you as a sports writer, or is there different ones for a fan? But what are the toughest venues or the best venues in the Big Ten for you to go visit, or maybe teams to play, however you want to take that? And then are there some favorites around the country that you've really enjoyed covering in your time of covering college basketball?
Well, as media seating has evolved over the course of the last 10 to 15 years, it's changed your perspective a little bit. I mean, the first time I went to Mackey, I believe was 2006. It was Robbie Hummel's freshman year. I think that was my first trip there. And then we sat down on the floor, that lowered floor below the floor, so you could really feel it coming down on you, the sound from the paint crew and all that. And it really made an impression upon me that you don't get quite the same now that we're up in what we get is still certainly a good seat and you can still see the floor and all that, but you don't feel what you felt in those days. And so from my standpoint, you have to sort of judge it based on the best case scenario. And so for me, what it was then was Mackey was really an impressive place to go see a game and to feel that crowd energy just roll onto you. And you could tell why it made an impact on the opposition. I have been to the RAC, and I haven't been there in 30 years. But when I covered Duquesne back in 88, 89, one of Rutgers' most recent NCAA tournament appearances was kind of launched in a game that I covered. They hadn't been much, just sort of playing, and then all of a sudden they just turned it on. They won a bunch in a row, and that game was the one that started it. Bob Wenzel put on a press, and I think he caught something that day. And you have always sat up at the rack. It's never been a floor seating arrangement. So, but you could sort of feel why that's a difficult place to play for the opposition, because it's really compact. The seats are right on top of the floor. It's not that big. The roof is low. And so it really contains the sound. So why Rutgers is that good at home, not a surprise to me at all, because even though I've never been on the floor for that, I've seen how really contained the sound is, and it's pretty impressive. There aren't very many bad. I mean, Wisconsin is a beautiful arena. The Breslin Center is really cool. Assembly Hall, very unique. I like Assembly Hall much better now as a spectator, not from, as a consumer of the game, I guess I should say. When I was younger, maybe 25, 30 years ago, when they had that low camera position, I hated games at Assembly Hall because you couldn't see anything. Since they've fixed that, rearranged it, and got a camera position now where you can actually see the game, it's much better. And then from a standpoint of going down there, it's a very cool place to be. I've sat in a lot of different areas, on the floor back when I went to an IU Michigan State game, probably around 2001, something like that. In the end zone, what they now call the penalty box, in the corner end zone, in the upper end zone beneath the banners. I mean, they've had us all over the place. And then there's that strip of seats that are right above the benches where the radio guys sit. I've been there. And it's always a cool place to go to. I really do enjoy Assembly Hall. From a national standpoint, when I've been asked to vote in panels about best arena in college basketball, I mean, I will die on the hill that Allen Fieldhouse is the best. If I always tell college basketball fans, if they ever have a chance, bucket list kind of deal, try to go to a game at Allen Fieldhouse. It is just especially a Saturday afternoon game where the sun doesn't come shining in through like it used to, because they blocked it off a little bit for TV. They sort of made the end zone seats, end zone windows translucent. But when the sun used to come in, it was really something to see. And it's still the fans there are tremendous. I really love it there. Cameron Indoor Stadium is very cool, but it's not Allen Fieldhouse. That's just the best. And as my colleagues Dave Revson and Steve Bardo demonstrated when they did the Iowa Penn State game this year at the Palestra is awesome. I mean, I talked to John Feinstein a couple weeks ago for an interview over his book, The Back Roads to March. And he has a lot of copy in that book about the Palestra, because the book is about basically mid-majors, low majors, and what they go through to try to get to the tournament. And he said that his wife once said that if she ever can't find John for an extended period of time, she'll call the cops and send him to the Palestra, because they'll probably be there. It's a great building. It has like a museum on the concourses of basketball and Philadelphia basketball history. Highly recommend a game there if you can do it. And especially, when I went there once in 1986 or 87, I think it was 86, 87 season. So it would have been February of 87. I was doing a story for the Pittsburgh paper about Doug West, who was from Altoona, which was about an hour and a half from Pittsburgh. So he's kind of semi-local. And so I went and I covered a practice. And then the next day I was going to see them play St. Joe's. And I walked in, and Joe Giuliano, who's still with the Philadelphia Inquirer, terrific sports writer, said, what are you doing here? And I said, well, I'm doing a story about Doug West. And he said, so you ever been to one of these St. Joe's Villanova games? I said, no. He says, oh my gosh, what you're in for. Now, remember, Villanova was headed to the NIT that year, and St. Joe's, I think, ended up winning 11 games. And it was the most ferocious game I've ever seen in terms of the crowd. I mean, it was the place was packed. The fans were all over each other, and in a good way, but I mean, it was just, the ferocity was unbelievable between two teams that had zero chance of making the NCAA tournament. I will never forget that. They call it the Holy War. They don't usually play it now at the Palestra because they want to be on campus. But That was one of the most amazing games that I've ever seen. And the Palestra certainly added to the atmosphere.
Well, Mike, both of those are on my bucket list. I coach high school basketball, so it's sometimes hard to get out for a weekend and go travel. But at some point, I am going to make it to the Palestra and to Allen Fieldhouse. But we thank you for taking time on this Monday to talk a little bit of scheduling philosophy and how Indiana fits into next year. We hope you continue to be safe, and we will talk to you next week.
Sounds great. Thanks very much, Brian.
All right, thanks, Mike. That's Mike DeCourcy from the Big Ten Network, Sporting News, and Fox. Go read his stuff. It's really, really solid. Make sure you're connecting with the Assembly Call Radio on Thursday night. Join us at the community. Go to assemblycall.com and /community. We have a lot of interaction and meetings going on in the community. We just like to help Indiana basketball fans pass this time and the offseason in discussing Indiana basketball. So we'll see you next week. Thanks for watching.